This hearing will come to order. Thank you all for being here today. 1 year ago today, Lion Air Flight 610 crashed into the sea shortly after takeoff from Jakarta, Indonesia. All 189 people on board perished. 5 months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 departed Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Just like Lion Air Flight 610, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 experienced problems shortly after takeoff and crashed. All 157 persons on board died. Both of these accidents were entirely preventable. We cannot fathom the pain experienced by the families of those 346 human beings who were lost. Many family members are here today, and we appreciate their attendance. I appreciate many of them meeting with members of the committee over time. As chairman of this committee, I promise their loved ones that we are working to obtain a full answer as to how to prevent future tragedies. These families deserve answers, accountability, and action, and the public deserves no less. The type of aircraft involved in both accidents is a 737 MAX 8 manufactured by Boeing. International aviation safety regulators began grounding the MAX the day after the Ethiopian crash. On March 13, Federal Aviation Administration formally grounded the aircraft in the United States. The MAX's return to service is contingent on Boeing's work with the FAA to test and certify fixes to the MCAS flight control system, which activated during both crashes. In order for the MAX to return to service, international regulators also need to be satisfied that it is safe to fly. As the certification process continues, many questions remain about Boeing's actions and the FAA's actions during the design, development, and certification processes, as well as the operation of the MAX. Today's hearing is divided into two panels. Let me note for senators that the committee will follow regular order in recognition of both panels. The 5-minute rule will be observed strictly because we have so many people who wish to participate. On the first panel, Dennis Muilenburg, President and CEO of Boeing, will testify on behalf of the aircraft manufacturer. He is accompanied by John Hamilton, Chief Engineer for Boeing Commercial Airplanes, who will provide technical expertise. Our second panel will examine these issues from the government's perspective. The witnesses today include National Transportation Safety Board Chairman Robert Sumwalt and Chairman of the Joint Authorities Technical Review, or JATR, Chris Hart. Chairman Sumwalt oversees the NTSB, which recently released a report and recommendations regarding the MAX certification. Chairman Hart led the JATR, an FAA-commissioned body that included the FAA, NASA, and 9 foreign aviation safety authorities tasked with reviewing the MAX's flight control systems. The JATR has submitted a broad range of recommendations to the FAA. Let me note that Chairman Hart has extensive past government service in aviation safety, but he is a private citizen today who agreed to lead the JATR. We have many concerns that Boeing should address today. We need to know if Boeing and the FAA rushed to certify the MAX. In particular, critics have focused on the MCAS development and testing. The JATR criticized Boeing's communication with the FAA on MCAS's development, particularly after the system was modified to activate at lower airspeeds. The JATR also criticized the FAA for relying on outdated regulations, guidance, and certification procedures, and failing to incorporate realistic human behavior factors into its assumptions. The NTSB also called into question Boeing's and FAA's assumptions about pilot reaction during MCAS activation. These questions were especially important for stressful situations with multiple alerts going off in the cockpit. Our witnesses should address the company and safety regulators' actions regarding MAX certification in general and MCAS in particular. The process for certifying the MAX necessitated a close partnership between Boeing and FAA. Under a decades-old system called Organization Design Authorization, or ODA, the FAA has delegated certain certification activities to the ODA holder, in this case, Boeing. While the ODA has been used to certify many aircraft over the years, some have criticized the system for permitting an inappropriately close relationship between companies and their safety regulator. Indeed, email correspondence dating from as early as 2015 between the MAX's former chief technical pilot, Mark Faulkner, and FAA personnel released on October 18 reflect a disturbing level of casualness and flippancy that seem to corroborate these criticisms. I was disappointed to learn of a November 2016 instant messenger conversation between Mr. Faulkner and a colleague in which he acknowledged misinforming the FAA. Boeing should have notified the FAA about that conversation immediately upon its discovery. Although FAA is not testifying today, let me express my frustration with the agency's lack of responsiveness to my request dating back to April of this year for documents relevant to the 737 MAX as part of the investigation that I opened as chairman based on whistleblower disclosures. The relationship between regulating agencies and organizations they regulate is important, but so are the internal reforms that Boeing is implementing. Witnesses should provide their views on the ODA system and whether or not reforms are needed. I invite Mr. Muilenburg to describe the steps Boeing is taking to improve aviation safety and to ensure that technical experts never experience undue pressure to put profits and relationships ahead of safety. The committee's oversight is not limited to past actions. The reviews by both JATR and NTSB note that future aircraft systems are likely to be even more complex and interdependent than current models. Managing interfaces between humans and machines will become even more important as automation increases. At the same time, commercial aviation is set to continue expanding around the globe. Many future pilots will fly in countries without the same training requirements and safety standards that we have in the United States. We welcome the witnesses' thoughts on how to improve design, development, and certification in the future to account for these major changes. This hearing will by no means end our inquiry. Additional oversight hearings will be held. The committee will carefully review the final Lion Air report, which was released on Friday, as well as the Ethiopian Airlines report, which is forthcoming. The committee will also consider the findings and recommendations from JATR, NTSB, and all other investigations and reviews. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member, Senator Cantwell, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this important hearing. I, too, want to take a moment and recognize the families who've lost loved ones in both the Ethiopian Airlines and Lion Air tragedies, some of whom are here with us today. I can't imagine the loss and the enduring pain that you must feel. I thank you for your vigilance on this issue, just as we have seen the families of Colgan Air Flight vigilance help us improve safety for the future. Right now, Mr. Muilenburg, these families, millions of airline passengers, and over 150,000 aerospace workers want to know what we are doing to fix what went wrong and what did go wrong. To date, we haven't gotten all those answers. Hopefully, today's hearing will help provide some. But one thing is crystal clear. If you want to be the leader in aviation manufacturing, you have to be the leader in aviation safety. Aviation demand, especially for 737s and single-aisle planes, is exploding to 101% growth over the next 10 years, something like 35,000 planes and $3 trillion. I think that's actually 20 years. But we cannot have a race for commercial airplanes become a race to the bottom when it comes to safety. The company, the board, cannot prioritize profits over safety. Safety always has to be job one. So it is troubling to hear that Boeing may have skirted the FAA certification process over a desire by airlines to have more fuel-efficient planes, but without pilot training. Now, this issue of lowering standards is permeating through all of aviation. We're dealing with it here in the committee. My Democratic colleagues have led the charge to try to stop companies coming here to say they don't want to have the same training for co-pilots on the regional jets because they don't have enough pilots. Or the issue my colleague has championed on rest requirements for cargo pilots having the same requirements for rest as passenger planes. Thank God Captain Sullenberger, the hero of the Hudson, made it clear. When you're in an emergency, the pilot and co-pilot don't have time, a lot of time, to communicate. So that is why today we need answers to how the first 737 MAX certification process was done, and we especially need transparency on this process of review before the 737 MAX is put in the air again. The public needs to know and fully understand what testing, what review, what processes were conducted both by Boeing and the FAA before this plane is put back in the air. We also want to know today about Boeing's safety culture, whether Boeing employees raised safety concerns that were not listened to, whether there was enough testing and complex system integration and information into a cockpit alert system that we now all know was flawed, and whether there was even enough data presented to the FAA. These are all questions that are important, including outsourcing of engineering and coding. There are many questions about software and cockpit automation and overload. I guarantee you the FAA codes and laws are clear when it comes to the standards for certification. Yes, software and automation, flight training, better rest requirements for pilots have all led to 10 years between 2009 to 2018 as the safest 10 years in aviation history. But more software and more automation without robust third-party testing and validation will lead us to where we are today. We should note that the last 5 aviation accidents have all involved this issue of automation and pilot response to automation, whether it's Lion Air, Ethiopian, the Asiana, the French, or Qantas 330 accidents. They were all in response to an automation and a command and a response from the pilot. So that is why last week I introduced legislation with my colleagues, Senators Duckworth and Senator Blumenthal, to implement the recommendations of the NTSB Safety Board and the Inspector General report on better safety management systems, better cockpit prioritization, and a new FAA Center of Excellence on flight automation and human factors. The FAA needs the best engineers to understand the engineering challenges of the future and stay ahead on this human behavior response to new automation. We're dealing, I see people here on the transportation automobile side. It's the same issue in advanced vehicles. What automation exists and how do humans respond to it? So I look forward to also hearing from Chairman Sumwalt and Chris Hart about their findings on improving the safety review process that we've included in this legislation. I would just say again, our sorrows are nothing like the families who are with us today. But I do want to note that 737 MAX accidents have struck at the heart of everyone in the Northwest. Soon after the Ethiopian crash, a Seattle firefighter approached me and asked if I thought he could get a job at Boeing. He said, I just want to go there and make sure we get the safety right. Everyone feels that way. Generation of workers in the Pacific Northwest have dedicated their lives to aviation excellence and safety, and that spirit lives on in Everett and Renton. So this isn't a question about line workers. This is a question about a corporate view from Chicago, whether there is enough attention to manufacturing and certification. You should take, offense to the fact that people say it's a great company not being run correctly. So for the 346 people who trusted Boeing without a second thought, we need to get this right. These families are counting on us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. Mr. Muilenburg, you have submitted an extensive written statement. It will be entered in full in the record at this point. You're now, and I understand Mr. Hamilton will not be making a formal statement. So, Mr. Muilenburg, you are recognized at this point to summarize your opening statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, sir.
Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Cantwell, committee members, thank you for the opportunity to join you today, and we share your commitment to aviation safety. Before we start today, I'd like to speak directly to the families of the victims who are here with us. On behalf of myself and the Boeing Company, we are sorry, deeply and truly sorry. As a husband and father myself, I'm heartbroken by your losses. I think about you and your loved ones every day, and I know our entire Boeing team does as well. I know that probably doesn't offer much comfort and healing at this point, but I want you to know that we carry those memories with us every day. And every day, that drives us to improve the safety of our airplanes and our industry. And that will never stop. I'm grateful and humbled to be here today and to be able to say these words to the families directly. And I want to convey our absolute commitment to safety, our commitment to learning, our commitment to rebuilding the public's confidence in what we do, and to preventing accidents from like this from ever happening again. We will never forget, and that is our commitment going forward. Mr. Chairman, I know this committee has many questions about the MAX. We'll do our best today to answer all of those questions. And while one of the accidents is still under investigation, we know both accidents involved the repeated activation of a flight control system called MCAS, which responded to erroneous signals from a sensor that measures the airplane's angle of attack. Based on that, we've enhanced MCAS in 3 ways. First, it will now compare information from both sensors instead of one before activating. Second, MCAS will only activate a single time. And third, MCAS will never provide more input than a pilot can counteract using the control column alone. Pilots will also continue to have the ability to override MCAS at any time. We've brought the best of Boeing to this effort. We've spent over 100,000 engineering and test hours. We've flown more than 800 test flights. We've conducted simulator sessions with 545 participants from 99 customers and 41 global regulators. I've flown on a couple of flights myself. This has taken longer than expected, but we're committed to getting it right. During this process, we've worked closely with the FAA and other regulators. We provided them documentation, had them fly the simulators, answered their questions, and regulators around the world should rigorously scrutinize the MAX and only approve its return to flight when they are completely satisfied with its safety. The public deserves nothing less. Mr. Chairman, today and every day, over 5 million people will board a Boeing airplane and fly safely to their destination. Decades of cooperation and innovation by industry and regulators and the rigorous oversight of this committee have reduced accidents by more than 95% over the last 20 years. But no number, other than 0 accidents, is ever acceptable. We can and must do better. We've been challenged and changed by these accidents. We've made mistakes, and we got some things wrong. We're improving, and we're learning, and we're continuing to learn. We established a permanent aerospace safety committee of our board. We've stood up a new safety organization. We've strengthened our engineering organization so that all engineers now report up through Boeing's chief engineer. We're also helping to rebuild the communities and families impacted by these accidents. We've pledged $100 million to this effort and have hired renowned experts in this area to ensure families can access these funds as quickly as possible. No amount of money can bring back what was lost, but we can at least help the families meet their financial needs. Mr. Chairman, I started at Boeing more than 30 years ago as a summer intern in Seattle. I was a junior at Iowa State University studying engineering, having grown up on a family farm in Iowa. I was awestruck to work at the company that brought the jet age to the world and helped land a person on the moon. Today, I'm still inspired by what Boeing does and by the remarkable men and women who are committed to its outstanding legacy. But these heartbreaking accidents and the memories of the 346 lives lost are now part of that legacy. It is our solemn duty to learn from them, and we will. Recently, there's been much criticism of Boeing and our culture. We understand and deserve this scrutiny. But I know the people of Boeing. They are more than 150,000 of the most dedicated, honest, hardworking men and women in the world. And their commitment to safety, quality, and integrity is unparalleled and resolute. We will stay true to those values because we know our work demands the utmost excellence. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muilenburg. During my opening statement, I mentioned an instant message conversation and then a series of emails. The instant message conversation was between the 737 MAX chief technical pilot and a colleague. And it expresses concerns about the operation of the MCAS. Boeing knew about this instant message for months, but failed to share it with the FAA until recently. With regard to the emails, again, Mr. Faulkner, the former MAX chief technical pilot, calls for removing any mention of the MCAS flight control system from the flight crew operating manual. He talks about Jedi mind tricking of regulators with at least one person who works for the FAA. So with regard to the instant message conversation, when were you made aware of the existence of the November 2016 messages?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, so I recall I was made aware of that message earlier this year. It was discovered as part of a document gathering process in response to a government investigation.
So it was after the crashes. You were made aware of it this year?
Sir, as I recall, I believe it was prior to the second crash earlier this year.
Was it your decision to wait months before disclosing this to the FAA?
Mr. Chairman, at that point, it had been identified as a document in response to an ongoing investigation, and I relied on our counsel to provide that to the appropriate authorities.
Okay, well, what did the counsel tell you? Did he say, I'm going to supply it to the Justice Department, or did he say, I'm going to get it to appropriate authorities?
And Mr. Chairman, I don't recall having a specific conversation about which authorities. Just, again, as part of this investigative process, our intent to cooperate fully with the request and to provide that to the appropriate authorities. And I think over this time period this year, we provided on the order of 500,000 pages of documents in support of various requests.
Well, do you agree that this should have been provided to the FAA in retrospect?
Yeah. Senator, as I became familiar with the details of the document over the last few weeks, as I expressed our disappointment and concern with how this came to the FAA. I think you heard the same from Administrator Dixon. I called him and apologized for how this had come through the process. Again, I was involved in the document production process, but it counted on our team to make sure all the right authorities were notified.
Okay, so we should look to the team then. Can you assure the committee that Boeing has now turned over all such safety-related communications to the FAA related to the 737 MAX?
Senator, our team continues to cooperate with all requests for documentation. I'm sure that additional documents will be provided over time as they're discovered, as would be normal to the process.
And,
but we will cooperate fully with the requests.
It seems to me that a request shouldn't have to have been made with regard to that IM conversation, sir. Let me ask you, when did you become aware of the emails that I referred to in the second part of my question about Jedi mind-tricking regulators?
Senator, again, just recently I've been informed of the details of those emails and the instant message that
Can you give us an
referred to.
idea of how recently?
Over the last couple of weeks when it became public news.
Okay, and you did not know about it until then?
Sir, I don't recall being briefed on the details of those documents any time prior to that.
Can you see that this raises much concern about the level of coziness between Boeing personnel and FAA regulators?
And Mr. Chairman, I understand the concern there. Again, we're doing our best to lean forward and provide information as part of this process. I can tell you that the comments, the values, the approaches that are described in those emails are counter to our values. That in no way would meet any expectation I would have for our team or our employees. So I understand the concern, share the concern, and just want to convey it's not consistent with our values as a company at all.
And this series of emails has only in the last few weeks come to your attention. Is that right, sir?
As Senator, as I said, I was aware of the documents that were being produced as part of an investigation. That's what I recall from earlier this year. I don't recall getting briefed on details of these documents. Those details are things that I learned of over the last few weeks.
Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and if you could help, I have a lot to go through, so we're going to try to move quickly through it. Was Boeing aware of the defects in the MCAS system, which it failed to disclose to the FAA at the time the aircraft was in development and certification?
Senator, as you know, the MCAS development occurred over a lengthy time period, about a 6-year development program of the MAX. We have learned from both accidents, and we've identified changes that need to be made to MCAS. We did, during the development process, follow our certification standards and long-standing industry standards behind the MCAS design. But clearly, we've learned, and there are things we need to improve on MCAS.
Are you saying?
Answer the question, Mr. Muilenburg.
Senator, could I ask you to?
Was Boeing aware of defects in the MCAS system, which it failed to disclose to the FAA at the time the aircraft was in development and certification?
Senator, I just have to question I'll say the premise of the question. So we as part of our development process, we do identify hazards and failure modes.
And they were disclosed?
That was part of the failure mode analysis that we shared as part of the certification process during that time period.
So you think everything that you were aware of was disclosed to the FAA as it relates to defects in the MCAS system?
Well, Senator, as we get to defects, things we need to fix, we've identified 3 areas that we talked about needing to address. One was the single sensor feed. That was a piece of the architecture that was shared with the FAA. The fact that the system would operate more than once during a flight, that was also part of the design description. And the control authority of the system at various parts of the flight envelope.
Do you know what Mr. Faulkner is referring to when he says unknowingly lied to the FAA or Jedi mind tricking?
Senator, I'm not sure what he meant by that. We haven't been able to talk to him. He doesn't work for Boeing anymore. We've been trying to contact him.
Here's my concern, that if you don't know what he meant, then you also don't know what wasn't disclosed. And so we don't know if there are things in the MCAS system that were defects that he or someone else knew about that weren't disclosed. So I hear what you're saying, that there's a lot to discover in a process, but I'd like to go over some of the very specifics about what was tested. And did Boeing test the consequences of the MCAS reliance on a single AOA sensor? Did it test that?
Yeah, Senator, we tested a broad array of different aspects of the MCAS system, a set of failure modes. We did thorough flight testing. I know, John, if you want to comment on the details there.
Yeah, Senator, the 737NG is one of the safest airplanes that's flown
Okay,
service.
look, we're trying to understand what got tested. So did you test the reliability of the AOA sensors in general? Did you test the reliability on a single sensor? Did you consult with the pilots on the lack of guidance on MCAS and the flight manuals? Did you test the AOA sensor's degree alert to ensure reliability? Did you test the human factor response? These are all things from the Lion Air report, and my guess is you didn't test those. And that's at the heart of this. But if you did, and you have data on that, and it was provided to the FAA, that's what we want to see.
So, Senator, we did test the MCAS uncommanded inputs to the stabilizer system due to whatever causes was driving it, not specifically due to an AOA sensor. We assessed that hazard level. We talked with our pilots.
Which now do you think is wrong?
In hindsight, Senator, yes.
Thank you, because I agree.
Yeah.
Senator, if I could just add a point to that, because as John pointed out, we relied on these longstanding industry standards as part of our evaluation of response time behind MCAS, and that is one of the areas that
Here's the thing
we found shortfall.
Here's the thing I'm very confused about, which is just this larger issue. And look, we want to get this right because we do want to go forward, and we know there is going to be automation in many aspects of our lives. But this robust testing that must occur and third-party validation, I just don't understand how you have sensors on the outside of a plane, and you're going to let that send a command to the inside of the plane that basically says trim the plane 2.5 degrees. And then all of a sudden, you're going to be yelled at from the cockpit from somebody saying pull up, and then the same time, you're being forced down in your nose, and you have seconds to respond because you're in takeoff. That doesn't seem like a lot of robust testing was done to me. Because if it was, then the Lion Air incident wouldn't have happened. Okay, so I see my time. I have a few seconds left. I want to just bring up a couple. Look, I think this whole issue of airspeed is a major issue writ large for all of us to get right, the sector. Those crashes about automation, even the Air France crash is related to a faulty pitot tube. I don't know how much we should be trusting things on the outside of the plane to give commands to the inside of the plane when they can be damaged. So. But I do want to know that you are improving the safety culture. This issue of both reporting, people not being able to talk to FAA, oversight people, and this issue of some of the machinist Boeing quality inspectors their work being taken over. I want to understand that a safety culture is going to exist.
Yeah. Senator, if anything I can leave with you today, I want to reinforce the culture of safety at Boeing. And we know we can improve. You know, we encourage our employees to speak up when there are issues, and some of those have been public recently. We respect and accept those inputs. We take action following on those. We have recently made a number of improvements that includes restructuring our safety review boards, elevating them to increase transparency and focus on safety. We've moved all 50,000 Boeing engineers to now report directly to our chief engineer, separating them from the businesses.
I'm going to ask you to come back on the SPIA and Boeing quality inspectors, two different issues with a written response. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I went over my time.
Thank you. And now I have the duty of telling the distinguished whip that he's limited to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Muilenburg, it's my understanding that the MCAS has been substantially redesigned to include several redundancies that will better prevent erroneous activation. Could you speak to why some of the changes being made in the reconfiguration of the MCAS were not considered in the initial development of the system?
Yes, Senator, I think you raise a very important point. And as John began to allude to earlier, the original concept for the MCAS design was an extension of what we call the speed trim system on the 737 NG, the previous version of the 737. That is a single sensor system that's been proven safe in flight, more than 200 million flight hours. So one of our safety principles is to minimize change from model to model. That is a good standard safety process. That was the concept behind the original MCAS design. Now, what we've learned from both accidents is that we made some mistakes. There are some things we can improve. One of them is this idea of going to a dual sensor feed instead of single, as well as limiting MCAS to a single action or activation during a flight. Those are improvements that we've identified. We take responsibility for that. We feel responsible for our airplanes, and we know that there are some fixes that we need to make. We own that, and we are implementing those fixes going forward.
As we discuss possible improvements to the certification of aircraft, it would be helpful for you to explain how safety is supposed to be integrated into the certification process from the initial conception of the aircraft all the way to flying at 30,000 feet, filled with passengers. Since these crashes, we've heard concerns about whether Boeing's relationship with the FAA is too cozy. We want a certification process that is efficient and that promotes U.S. competitiveness, but one that always prioritizes safety. So what would you say to address the concerns that have been raised about regulatory capture?
Senator, I agree with the focus in that area. I would say that over the last couple of decades, the improvements that have been made in aviation safety are because of strong government oversight. That includes the work of this committee. It includes the oversight of the FAA. The delegated authority process, as it's structured, we do think has contributed to safety of the industry. I mentioned in my comments that there's about a 95% improvement in safety over the last 2 decades. Some of that, I believe, is associated with the delegated authority. But we have to get the balance right. And I think it's very important that we have strong government oversight, strong FAA oversight, but we also tap the technical depth that our industry teams can bring to the table. That's the concept. But if we need to rebalance it, I fully support evaluating that concept, looking at the details, and making sure we've got the balance.
Could you briefly explain, very briefly if you could, how Boeing and the FAA work together to certify aircraft?
Yeah, Senator, I could, but I think Mr. Hamilton here is a deeper expert on that. If I could ask him to take that question.
Certainly. Senator, the FAA is actually in control of the certification process the whole time. So let me just kind of walk you through the process very quickly. Starts off by identifying the requirements to certify the airplane. That is the sole authority of the FAA. It establishes the certification basis of the airplane. The second step is identifying the methods of compliance to those requirements. So this is how you're going to show that your airplane design actually meets those requirements. Again, the FAA is the sole authority on that. That's their action. The third step is doing the testing, the analysis, and the documentation that demonstrates the airplane meets those requirements. And that is done by Boeing in our case, or the applicant. And then there's a review of those documents to validate that they actually met the requirements. And that can be done by the FAA or the ODA, who acts as a designee of the FAA, or it can be a combination. And finally, there's oversight. The FAA does oversight of the actual unit members. They do oversight of the ODA, and are you following the processes? They do oversight of, did you find compliance as they expected with the methods of compliance? And then they do systemic oversight of the entire system.
Okay. Mr. Muilenburg, how are you working to ensure, coming back to this issue of safety, that employees who raise concerns, even if they inhibit your ability to get a product to the market quickly, are taken seriously, and that importantly, those concerns are raised to the top and not brushed aside?
Yes, Senator, in my role as the CEO of this company, I take that responsibility very seriously. We have a number of ethics hotline avenues that our employees can use. When it comes to delegated authority in particular, we also have additional survey tools that we deploy, and we openly share that data with the FAA and make improvements. That said, again, we know we can improve. And one of the areas that I've taken recent action on is to restructure our safety organization. So we have now created a new safety organization, a Vice President, Beth Pastor, who reports to my chief engineer, who reports directly to me. That safety organization has responsibility for all safety-related accident investigations, our ODA process, and also responding to any employee concerns.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Senator Cantwell. I also want to give my sincere thanks to the people who are here, who lost their loved ones in these two crashes. I think you know you are here not only for them, and it must be hard to hear all of these technical issues when you think of your brother or sister or father or mother or son or daughter. But I want you to know that we want to get to the bottom of this, and we want to change this. So I guess I'd start with where Senator Thune was going with the FAA and Boeing and this relationship. A recent Inspector General report found that only 4% of airline manufacturers' employees responsible for conducting the certification were certified by the FAA that they conducted oversight. The same report found that one manufacturer approved about 95% of certifications for their own aircraft. What can you tell us about the percentage of certifications that Boeing conducts on its own aircraft?
Senator, I can't answer that number off the top of my head. I don't know, John, if you have a...
No, I'd have to follow up with you.
Okay.
Senator.
How many Boeing engineers both design systems for the company and then certify those same systems for the FAA? I'm just trying to get at a safety check from the
Yes.
outside.
So we have approximately 1,000 engineering unit members that work not just in systems.
But what percentage of them then certify the safety as opposed to having the FAA certify the safety?
Those are roughly 1,000 unit members that are acting on behalf of the FAA to find compliance. But that's beyond just systems. This includes structures and propulsion, so it's across the whole airplane.
Okay.
Senator, just to clarify, we have about 50,000 engineers at Boeing. About 1,000 of them are what we call operate in this area that John's referring to, unit members. So these are members
Okay.
who have the authority and the training.
Okay, why don't we'll follow up. And I am trying to get at when the FAA steps in and when you certify it yourself, and we'll get that later. 2 months after Mr. Faulkner sent these messages expressing safety concerns, he asked the FAA to remove mention of the MCAS automated flight control feature from the 737 MAX pilot's flight manual and training course, a change that the FAA approved in 2017. Notably, Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee report on the Lion Air crash confirms that the pilot's lack of knowledge of MCAS was one of the key reasons for the plane crash. How frequently are new automated systems left out of the manual and training that you give to pilots?
Senator, first of all, one of the things we've learned from both of these accidents is that we need to provide additional information on MCAS to pilots. Just to give you context, as we develop our training manuals, our idea is to provide training on pilots so they can respond to the effects of failures as opposed to trying to diagnose failures. And that's a very important distinction. And so more information in the training manuals is not necessarily safer, but as we understand from both of these accidents, we need to provide more information on MCAS to enhance safety. But we do try to include information in the training manuals that
But do you
focuses
think it's
on safety.
acceptable to have pilots flying planes without knowing about these key automated flight systems?
Senator, again, our approach is to train pilots on the effects of a failure mode. So in this case, the MCAS automation system, when it fails in what we call a runaway stabilizer, uncommanded movement of the horizontal tail. That is what's in the training manual, and we try to train pilots to respond to the effect of the failure as opposed to diagnosing.
Okay, let me move on to two more quick things. After these terrible crashes have claimed 346 lives, do you think it makes sense for these aircraft to be allowed to fly in some countries and not others? Because the FAA says each country can make its own decision.
Well, Senator, We respect the jurisdiction of the regulatory authorities around the world.
So you think it's acceptable? Just say yes or no.
Senator, that's up to the regulatory authorities. That's not a decision that we can make. We respect the authority of the regulators.
Okay, you're saying the same thing again, so I'm going to go with a yes. While there have been several factors that contributed to the plane crashes, one that is particularly troubling was highlighted in a recent article in the Washington Post, which found that the Lion Air had a faulty angle of attack sensor, which gave pilots and airplane systems unreliable information the day before it crashed. Do you think that's a problem, and what steps can be taken to change that?
Senator, in the case of the angle of attack disagree alert, we got the implementation wrong. I mentioned in my comments up front that we made some mistakes. We made a mistake on that implementation. Once we discovered it, our engineering teams quickly convened a safety review board. They confirmed that it wasn't an operational safety issue, and the FAA subsequently concurred with that. But nonetheless, we got the implementation wrong, and we've addressed the faults in the process. We have fixed that, and the angle of attack disagree alert will be standard implementation on all MAXs going forward.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, would like to recognize and offer my sympathies to the people that are here today and the people who are at home who have lost loved ones in these crashes. I hope that we can get answers at this hearing and also in the future so that these issues, these mistakes will not happen again and cause future loss of life. Mr. Muilenburg, the Joint Authorities Technical Review notes that Boeing made several other changes to the 737 MAX that differ from the earlier models, such as structural changes that would accommodate the new engines that were planned on the plane and other advanced technologies. Senator Thune touched on this with the delegated authority. Was Boeing delegated authority over the certification of those changes as well?
Senator, I can't answer that question completely because, as you pointed out, there were a number of changes. Again, those are done and evaluated jointly with the FAA. You know, John, if you want to comment on any specifics there.
There was approximately 92 certification plans associated with the MAX, which encompass all the different changes to the airplane. The FAA reviewed approximately 8 of those initially, and
Are you looking into those certification processes as part of your review of the 737 MAX?
Senator, yes, we are. I asked my board to set up an independent review committee headed by Admiral Giambastiani about 5 months ago. And that committee did its work, provided inputs that we're acting on. And with the other authorities, we're continuing to take a hard look at that, and we look forward to taking action on those reports.
Okay. Also, the Joint Authorities Technical Review included a recommendation that states, quote, if any flight control surface is used in a novel manner, the FAA should be directly involved. This is based on the observation that the FAA was not completely unaware of MCAS, but because information and discussions about MCAS were so fragmented and they were delivered to disconnected groups within the process, it was difficult to recognize the impacts and the implications of this system. Do you agree that the communication between Boeing and the FAA is fragmented to the point that relevant information on MCAS was not provided to the agency? Is this what you were referring to when you talked about getting the balance right?
Senator, I think you raised some very good points there. I do think one of the areas we can improve, and we've seen it in the JATR report and others, is system-wide integration, cross-system integration amongst the different technical expertise areas, and improvements in documentation and communication. And again, we found some areas there where we could have, should have done better.
Do you
and we're
think
making
those steps
changes.
will improve your communication with the FAA?
Senator, I do.
Do you think the FAA has a responsibility to also change its process to improve communication?
Senator, I believe the FAA does, but I wouldn't say that's only the FAA's responsibility. We at Boeing need to make some improvements in communication, and we own that, and we're committed to doing that.
Okay. the Boeing 737 airplanes are based on a type certificate. That was originally provided in 1967, I believe, and it has been amended to address the different 737 models since then. That technical review notes that, quote, some elements of the design and certification remain rooted in the original 1967 certification of the Boeing 737-100. Does Boeing or the FAA review the elements of the 737 that are based in the 1967 certification for continued safety when new models of the airplane are produced?
Senator, if I could ask John to field that question.
Senator, as you note, there's a single type certificate for the 737, but as the design has evolved with each new generation of airplanes, the safety standards on which the airplane is designed to have also evolved. Yes, there are some amendments that the design might reference back to an earlier amendment level, but those are likely changes that have not changed in the family of airplanes since the original design. An example might be some of the structural elements. However, we have stepped up in many areas voluntarily to later amendment levels to demonstrate that it still meets the latest standards in compliance.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both our witnesses for being here today, and thank you, most important, to the relatives who have lost loved ones. If you could please stand so we could thank you all. Thank you for being here. If you could just stand. Thank you.
And go ahead up and hold up the photographs that you brought. You've been very kind to.
I was going to ask that you hold up those photographs because I understand that for security purposes you can't during the hearing, but just for this short period of time. Mr. Muilenburg.
So thank you. And if the timekeeper could start Senator Blumenthal's time over. Thank you very much to the family members. Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Muilenburg, as I watched those loved ones stand, and frankly, as I reviewed this file over the past week or so again, and as I sit here today, my anger has only grown. These loved ones lost lives because of an accident that was not only preventable, as the chairman said at the very start, but was the result of a pattern of deliberate concealment. Boeing came to my office shortly after these crashes and said they were the result of pilot error. Those pilots never had a chance. These loved ones never had a chance. They were in flying coffins as a result of Boeing deciding that it was going to conceal MCAS from the pilots. And the best evidence is this message from Mark Faulkner saying, in effect, we're going to conceal MCAS, delete it from the manual used in training. When did you become aware of the fact that MCAS was not going to be included in the flying manual?
Senator, first, if I could express my my deep sympathies for the
You've
families.
done that, and my time is limited. I apologize for interrupting you, but I want to know specifically when you became aware of this effort.
Senator, I can't reference that email. I'm not.
I'm
sure
not
I have
asking you
time
about
for
the
that.
email. You've been asked about the email already. I'm asking you about Boeing policy as reflected in this email. Its chief test pilot deciding he was going to mislead pilots who were then going to take passengers into the air, these loved ones, and turn those planes into flying coffins.
Senator, I'm not sure what Mr. Faulkner meant by that email. I can tell you that certification and training materials are not determined by one individual.
Well, in
There were
fact,
large-
let me just interrupt you again. In the over 1,600-page original flight manual of Boeing 737 MAX, the aircraft's new MCAS computer system was mentioned only once in 1,600 pages in the glossary of abbreviated terms. So when Boeing came to us and they said it's the pilots, inexperienced pilots, you were lying to us as well.
Senator, if I could try to respond to your question, first of all, the premise that we would lie or conceal is just not consistent with our values.
Well, I know it's not consistent with the values that you're articulating here, but let me just, since my time is limited, move on. Would you agree that this system of certification and oversight is absolutely broken? That's the lesson here, isn't it? That Boeing lobbied the Congress for more delegation, and now we have to reverse that delegation of authority. Would you support those legislative efforts?
Senator, again, I support taking a hard look at the delegated authority
I'm not
process.
asking you for a hard look. I'm asking you for a commitment here because you have the opportunity to make things right.
Senator, I'm not familiar with particular legislation, but I
Well,
am committed
Boeing
to
asked for it.
working and supporting.
Boeing asked for the legislation that exists right now. Will you commit to supporting reform efforts such as many of us on this committee have advocated?
Senator, we'll commit to participating in those reform efforts and providing our inputs.
Well, I agree that your input would be valuable. I'm looking for input in support of reform that will stop outsourcing by the FAA. And I might just add, the FAA has been really disappointing in its disclosure to us. This is an example of the kind of disclosure the FAA has given us, total redaction. I've asked for full disclosure of documents. The FAA has failed to provide them. I've asked for the FAA to return my phone calls. It's failed to do so. And I think the FAA is part of this problem as well. And it is the result, at the end of the day, of Boeing rushing this process. I'm using the chairman's term, putting profits over safety, rushing the certification process with you in charge of that certification and prioritizing speed and cost over safety. And my time has expired, but the folks who really deserve time here are the people who lost loved ones. And
Thank you,
hoping
Senator
we'll have a second
Blumenthal.
round. Thank you.
Let's do this. This poster is entitled MCAS Lives in Both FCCs. If you can provide a copy of that, we'll admit it into the record at this point without objection.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Hamilton, let me just ask you, when it says MCAS does live in both FCCs, what does that mean?
Sure, certainly.
Just briefly.
The MCAS function is replicated in the two flight control computers that are on board the airplane. And so each flight control computer previously received its input from one AOA sensor on the left or right side. In the software changes we're making going forward, now both flight control computers will receive the data from both sensors, compare it, and only if they agree, they will activate.
Okay, thank you. Senator Moran.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Muilenburg, have you determined that the failures that resulted in the tragic consequences, were they failures in the policies and protocols that Boeing had in place, or was it a failure to comply with those protocols and policies that resulted in these consequences?
Yeah. Senator, in some cases, we relied on these longstanding industry standards, policies, and certified to those, and we're now raising questions around those. That gets back to this pilot response time discussion that we had earlier. In some cases, we missed on implementation, as I mentioned earlier, with the angle of attack sensor. But overall, we did follow the certification process and steps But nonetheless, we've learned from both of these accidents, and the fixes that we need to make are clear.
So the
and we're
fixes
committed
are
to doing
both
that.
in policy and then making certain that the policies are followed once the new policies are in place?
Senator, I believe that both are true, yes.
Thank you. And I assume there's other certification and just developments at Boeing that are always ongoing. Have you changed your behavior and/or policies for the certification and development process for other pieces of equipment, other aircraft, that Boeing is now proceeding towards certification?
Senator, we have, and we're going to continue to change. As I said, we have learned, but we're still learning. I mentioned earlier the change to our Safety Review Board structure. That is a big substantive change. The stand-up of our new safety organization, the realignment of our engineering team, those 50,000 engineers. We're also taking a look at some of those long-standing assumptions behind how we design as we look at next-generation products like the 777X as an example. So we are taking a comprehensive approach to those updates.
As this committee looks certainly at certification, as we look at the FAA, what suggestions does Boeing have for this committee when you look at any policies or failures at the FAA? So the way I would view this is we have two major organizations involved in this process. One is the manufacturer, Boeing. The other is the federal agency that is there to certify. My assumption is that neither one did things right. And what have you learned about the FAA that we should know as we look at the FAA now and in the future?
Well, Senator, we have a great deal of respect for the FAA. I personally worked with the FAA for many years, have a great deal of respect for them and their professionals. I know the FAA is also taking a hard look at all of the reports and inputs and investigations and is committed to making changes. I think you've heard that from Administrator Dixon.
Do you have suggestions what changes the FAA should make?
Senator, I don't have specific recommendations for you, but we'd be glad to follow up on that if it'd be useful.
Thank you. Where are we now in the 737 MAX? It seems like every week there's a report that an airline believes they're going to have that plane flying again, or that certification is nearby.
Yeah.
What is the status?
Senator, we're in the final stages of the process. So we are currently testing the final software updates. When ready and with the FAA's approval, we'll proceed to a certification flight in the near term. Subsequent to that, it'll be the FAA's responsibility to evaluate that and issue an airworthiness directive. That's all work that we're proceeding on over the next few weeks and months. But I think it's important, again, that the airplane will return to service when it's safe. Right? This is not going to be timeline-driven. We are committed to answering every question the regulators have, and the airplane will fly when everyone is convinced it's safe. That is the most important thing here.
It troubles me that to get to that point it's certainly not that it's taking so long. I want the result that you just described. We want the right circumstance before we're flying again. But it suggests to me that there were much more significant problems with the MAX 37 if it was previously certified, and yet now it takes so long. It's something more than just a glitch. It's something more than just a minor change. That makes me concerned about the process that allowed it to be certified in the first place. What am I missing?
Yes, Senator, I think you raise a very good point. Our initial effort early this year was focused on the MCAS updates that we've already talked about. Around the middle of the year, as we were evaluating all of the other inputs and data, we identified some additional safety enhancements that we could make, not something that was required for certification, but something that we thought while the airplane was grounded was the right thing to do and a safety enhancement. And rather than waiting to do that later after return to service, we as a company and with the FAA decided that we would take the extra time for those additional software updates. And that's the work we've been doing through the summer and into the fall. That's designed to add additional software redundancies throughout the flight control computers. And that is the final software we're testing. what I want to convey here is this is really the culture of Boeing, and I understand the questions that are being raised, but when our teams find opportunity to improve safety, that goes to the top of the list. That's the top priority. And if it takes time, if it takes money to do that, that's where we're focused, and that's why it's taking longer than I think some anticipate.
I'd request your follow-up on your thoughts about the FAA. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Moran, Senator Markey, Senator Udall, Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me begin also by expressing my sympathies to those who lost loved ones in the two 737 MAX crashes. And I'd like to thank the families that are here today for your continued attention to safety and for working to prevent future tragedies like we saw here. Over the years, our aviation system has become the safest in the world, but these tragedies certainly remind us that we cannot rest. Safety cannot be taken for granted. There is no doubt from what we've been hearing in the testimony here today that many mistakes were made and the consequences were unfortunately tragic. The reports from technical experts underscore that as technology becomes increasingly complex, the debate about how to move forward can't be simply about a one-size-fits-all regulatory regime versus a let the free market just police itself type of approach. I believe a new paradigm may need to be developed to address the regulatory challenges associated with very complex technology, and that's something this committee needs to weigh in very heavily into as we move forward. Mr. Muilenburg, as you know, the BP oil disaster in the Gulf of Mexico killed 11 workers, lasted 87 days, and cost upwards of $65 billion. And in the wake of that disaster, it was revealed that the oil and gas industry had lobbied for the reduced safety precautions that could have prevented that disaster. We often hear in Congress about how much regulations cost industry. However, thoughtful regulation plays an incredibly important role in protecting the public. So I'm curious if Boeing's view on oversight has changed in the wake of this tremendous human tragedy, as well as the cost that this company is facing right now. Has your view changed? You talked in response to an earlier question about having a balance.
Yep.
Clearly something is wrong with that balance. Please let me know if your thoughts have changed recently.
Senator, my thoughts have changed. We have learned lessons from these two accidents, and the families that are here with us today, the pictures we saw, they're heartbreaking. They remind us of the importance of the work we do and the paramount importance on safety. That's what makes this industry great, and strong oversight is part of the fabric of our industry, always has been. And I think this should give us pause to take a hard look at that.
Well, the hard look, you said we need to look at the balance. Has the balance gone too far to allowing industry to police itself?
Senator, I don't know if I can characterize it that way. My sense is that we all have the same objective here. We all want the safest industry possible. That is our objective. And my sense is that we could look at the balance, that there are refinements that would be worthy. I think, technology.
Do you think it's out of balance now, based on what happened here? Do you think we have to not just take a look at it, but seriously understand that the balance is maybe out of whack if we delegate too much to industry and don't have impartial eyes and make sure the regulatory regime is sufficient, that you truly have impartial eyes looking at these factors? But it's going to save lives, and you won't put a company through the cost that you have when you balance those regulations. Is it out of balance right now? Yes or no?
As Senator, again, I think it can be improved. I completely agree with you on the importance of strong oversight. Yeah, I've worked in this industry for more than 3 decades, from airplanes to spacecraft. People's lives depend on what we do, and strong oversight from the government is a key to our successful, the safety of our industry. So I think we have a shared objective there, and we will work with you on examining any improvements we can make. We have a mutual interest.
Mr. Muilenburg, the NTSB report indicated that the FAA and industry have historically used highly trained test pilots to verify the safety of new aircraft models rather than average pilots who typically have less experience. Does Boeing use pilots with average training and experience?
Senator, our Boeing test pilots are experienced, highly qualified pilots. We work with airlines, the FAA, the regulators, to bring other pilots in from around the world as part of the evaluation. But I think, as you're pointing out, as we look to the future, again, we want to make sure that the testing we're doing is representative of that future pilot population.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member as well. I want to say, first of all, to the families who are here, extending my sympathies, but also my gratitude for you coming forward through your pain to bring to us, to Congress, which is not an easy thing to do, your frustrations and probably stronger feelings in the loss of your loved ones. I will say that when Colgan Flight 3407 went down in Buffalo in the early 2009, the families that came forward to us, I was on Transportation Committee and the House side, made such an incredible impact and has made flying on our regional airlines much, much safer because of that. So hopefully that will be what the result of this is for you today and for all of us. Mr. Muilenburg, particular attention has been called to the fact that Boeing, later in the development process of the MAX, revised the range of flight conditions that could lead to activation of the MCAS, but that Boeing did not notify the FAA of these changes at the time. This is troubling if in fact this is true. Was Boeing not obligated by the FAA to report changes like the ones I just described?
Yes. Senator, I believe you're referring to the low-speed extension
Yes.
of MCAS. And I've seen those same reports, but they do not reflect the facts. The extension of MCAS to low speeds was done in a rigorous way. It was done in a very visible way. There was testing done on that from the mid-2016 timeframe to the early 2017 timeframe, including flight tests with the FAA on board. The FAA was aware of the low-speed extension and ultimately certified that. And I believe FAA leadership has publicly stated the same.
So that's a false report then?
I believe it's a false report. I believe the low-speed extension was fully certified with the FAA.
Okay. Another report that's been out in the media and among is that after the second flight went down, that Boeing actually actively lobbied the FAA to keep the planes in the air. Can you respond to that?
Senator, could you just clarify your question in
Yes,
terms?
after the second plane went, the Ethiopian Air
Yeah.
went down,
Yeah.
that there was quite, several countries had
Yeah.
expressed had limited the flight of that plane. We had not done that yet in the United States. There's media reports that Boeing was actively lobbying the FAA to keep the planes in the air at that time in this country. Is that true?
Yeah. Senator, let me clarify what was happening in that time frame.
Could you make it brief, please?
Yes. We immediately after that accident reached out to the FAA and other regulatory authorities to understand what happened in the accident. What has made aviation safe is that we make decisions based on data. At that point, we didn't have data, and so we, with the FAA, were looking to understand what happened. There were early reports that the airplane had some kind of a low-speed, low-altitude problem that turned out to be incorrect. So we, with the FAA, were pursuing data to make a good safety-based decision. That was our position with the FAA. When data became available, satellite data that was referred to in the
Right.
media, again, with the FAA, we came to a conclusion that there could be similarities between the two accidents, and that led very quickly to a decision to ground the fleet.
Well, I think, in retrospect, I think it was pretty obvious, and I don't want to say conclusively so, but there was a problem and a consistent problem. The other thing that's really bothered me about this whole thing, and I questioned this in the last committee hearing that we haven't, between the Lion Air crash and the Ethiopian Air crash, it defies logic to me that some of these folks who wrote emails or sent text messages did not come to you and to the expertise of the engineering of these engines and of these planes and say, this is what we were talking about. Why was there any reaction at all like that within your company after the Lion Air crash, and don't tell me because you didn't have the official report, that would have maybe saved those people in that Ethiopian airplane?
Senator, I think about that decision over and over every day. And if we knew everything back then that we know now, we would have made a different decision
Okay, the
back
question then, did people come to you at the highest levels, at any level, and say, wait a minute, this is sounding familiar? Yes or no?
Senator, after the first accident, we convened our broad technical team across Boeing. It wasn't any single individuals or a small team. It was a broad team. We brought all those experts to bear, trying to assemble data from the accident, understanding what occurred. We quickly, with the FAA, issued an operational bulletin to remind everyone of the training and the emergency scenario that
Around
we saw.
that particular system?
Around what we called runaway stabilizer, which again is the effect of that system. And at the same time, we began work on an MCAS software update in that time frame.
So the answer is yes. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just one point of clarification. Are you saying, Mr. Muilenburg, the FAA did know about the 2.5 trim, not 0.6, but 2.5? The FAA knew about that?
Yes, Senator, you're referring to the low-speed extension, which is the 2.5-degree trim.
Yes.
That is the low-speed extension. The FAA did know about that.
Thank
and participated.
Senator Udall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member for having this hearing. And Mr. Muilenburg, you know, I first want to say to all the people that stood up that I'm very moved by you being here, and your losses are very, very, I think, heartfelt across the committee here. And, you know, the thing that really bothers me is knowing that it's preventable. It makes it even more outrageous that we haven't made the kind of dramatic changes that I want to talk to the CEO here about. Mr. Muilenburg, you showed some emotion when these folks stood up and everything. What should come from that emotion is some action to do something to really make a difference. And for this committee to coalesce around the solution that's really going to move us forward would require you to step forward and specifically say what you support. And I haven't seen you do that in all the questioning. You've been asked over and over again, what would you support? I mean, it's absolutely clear that it's too cozy a relationship with the FAA and your airline. And so what is it you're going to commit to specifically in terms of reform? That's why you're up here. And that's what we want to see you do, is to weigh in with us. This is what would make a difference. This is what would make it safer. This is what would make sure that we don't lose passengers like this in the future, or the crew.
Senator, while I respectfully don't agree with the characterization of coziness with the FAA, we respect the independent oversight of the FAA, and that's very important to us from a safety principle standpoint. We have taken a number of internal actions that we think are meaningful as they relate to our own internal reforms on safety. We are engaged in the legislative process. And Senator, I appreciate your invitation for us to be involved in that. I know there are many stakeholders. As you heard from me earlier, we are committed to strong oversight in the aerospace industry. It's part of what makes this system safe. We have a shared objective, and if there are things we can do to make it better, we will. I don't know, John, if you have any specific ideas there.
Yeah, Senator, you know, I would say that, you know, one of the big issues was we used an industry standard assumption on pilots and how they would react, and that proved incorrect in these two accidents. So in terms of things that I think we need to change with the FAA is we need to go revisit some of these regulatory guidances and make sure that they're up to date. I would even tell you that there's probably some regulations that we advocated as part of the FAA reauthorization bill, 10 regulations that FAA should work with industry to update based on technology that's out there today.
Well,
But in terms of coziness, I used to be the lead administrator for the ODA, and I can tell you that we have a respectful relationship with the FAA, but we do have our differences of opinion sometimes. But we discuss those, we work it out on how we're going to comply, and it's not a cozy relationship. It's a professional relationship.
Well, it's a relationship that didn't work for the consumers in this and for your employees that went down in those flights. You and others in your company blamed the deceased pilots and the culture of the countries where the crashes occurred for the accidents. But from what we've seen in the last year since the first crash, it appears that Boeing's own culture is more blameworthy for installing a faulty system that resulted in too many deaths and could have caused more. This culture starts at the top, and that's why I've been asking you for the specifics of what you support. And I hope after this hearing you will come forward and when there's legislation out there, say this is going to make it better, and come up here and spend some time to build the consensus to get this done, because I think the large, powerful interests that are a part of this don't want any reform. They want you to tinker around like you're talking about, but they don't want to see any reform. If Boeing could not guarantee that pilots were prepared to fly these jets, your company should not have sold them. Did anyone at Boeing question, hesitate, or raise any issues prior to selling the 737 MAX 8 with this software to Lion Air or Ethiopian Air?
Senator, first, we look forward to responding to your request there and providing inputs on the reforms. To your question, we do rely on the airlines and the regulatory authorities around the world as part of this integrated system to make sure we're fielding airplanes and crews that can fly safely. I do think it's important for me to clarify a point that you made earlier. We have not blamed the pilots, and I know that's been reported, but that is not our company position, and it never will be. We are responsible for our airplanes. We are responsible, and we own that, regardless of cause. Any accident with one of our airplanes is unacceptable.
Well, that
unacceptable.
change is welcome, but that about the culture went out from your company early on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Udall. Let's do this at this point. Mr. Muilenburg, the JATR published 12 main recommendations. Will both of you get back to us on the record and tell you Boeing's position with regard to these 12 recommendations?
Senator, we will.
Thank you. Senator Markey is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by recognizing the families who lost so much on this flight. Many of you are here today, including Michael Stumo and Nadia Milleron, the parents of Samia Stumo, a University of Massachusetts Amherst graduate and a resident of Sheffield, Massachusetts, who was tragically killed on the Ethiopian flight. The losses that the Stumo family and all of the families suffered is absolutely inexcusable, and we will remember that as we are moving forward in the drafting of legislation. We will do it in the memory of your families. One thing is clear to make sure that safety is our top priority is to guarantee that every aviation safety measure is built into every plane and that it is never for sale. Unfortunately, our current laws only prevent aircraft manufacturers like Boeing from selling critical safety elements for an additional price. Existing rules allow companies to charge extra for non-critical safety-enhancing features, and Boeing actually does charge more for those technologies. The 737 MAX aircraft involved in the Indonesian and Ethiopian crashes lack two safety-enhancing features: an angle of attack indicator and a disagree light. Both of these technologies would have helped the pilots recognize that faulty sensor readings were causing the plane's automated flight control system to push the aircraft's nose down towards the ground. With that knowledge, the pilots may have been able to take more effective action to prevent these crashes. In fact, the Indonesian crash report released last week specifically cited the lack of a disagree light on the 737 MAX as contributing to the Lion Air tragedy. Shamefully, the law allows Boeing to treat these safety technologies as a la carte add-ons that airlines can obtain only by paying an extra fee. A la carte add-ons, safety. Not like XM radio or leather seats on a plane. Safety is a la carte. Safety is an added-on feature. These tragic crashes have made it all too clear that there should not be any distinction between critical and non-critical safety-enhancing features. And that's why I've introduced my Safety is Not for Sale legislation. My bill will require aircraft manufacturers like Boeing to offer or provide any technology that measurably enhances safety without an additional charge to airline carriers. If you believe that, that safety should never be for sale, the question is, why was it? Now, you seem to now recognize that the disagree light should be standard, but you have yet to say the same thing about the angle of attack indicator and whether or not that should be offered for free, or whether or not each airline should be given the option of not building it into the plane for free. So I think you have to make a decision here in terms of where you're going to go, because otherwise your disagree light is still on, coming from Boeing towards these safety features. So I want, first of all, to have you answer whether or not you, according to the Wall Street Journal, you agree that Boeing did not originally include the disagree light on the 737, even though the same technology was standard on prior models of airplanes. Is that correct?
Senator, I feel I need to respond to your earlier point about selling safety. We don't sell safety. That is not our business model. And I do want to clarify your points on the angle of attack indicator. That is a system that we have offered as an option to airlines. Some airlines don't want it. It's not necessarily a safety improvement. It actually takes up space on the flight deck displays, and more information on the displays is not necessarily safer. So that is not a safety feature. On the angle of attack disagree.
No, I'm saying you should not offer it for a price. You should give the option to the airline without any price attachment. Do you agree to do that?
And Senator, yes. Okay. And in fact, we've already announced that the angle of attack disagree alert will be on all MAX airplanes going forward, standard, and the angle of attack indicator will be available as an option to all airlines.
So given
no cost.
your stated support for the principle behind my legislation, will you support my legislation that ensures that you offer to provide any technology that measurably enhances safety without an additional fee to airlines? Would you agree to support that legislation?
Senator, I haven't seen the specific legislation. I think the principle around focusing on safety as a top priority is, I agree with that, and it's a worthy principle. And I'd ask if we could take a look at the legislation.
The key is just the word is free to an airline for anything that measurably impacts safety. Do you agree?
Yeah, we don't sell safety, and that's not our business model.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm going to try to put some of the issues here into layman's terms. I want to first, of course, my sincere condolences to the families who are here, but also to the families in Ethiopia and in Indonesia who are watching this hearing or will be watching this hearing. I don't speak Amharic, but for the Indonesians, kepada keluarga korban yang dan orang-orang Indonesia, selamat datang. Dan saya ingin memberitahu Anda bahwa kami senator akan sepenuhnya menyelidiki penyebab tragedi ini. And what I just said was we will, as senators, get to the bottom of this tragedy, and we will continue to investigate this, and we will not stop. Because you see, Boeing sells its aircraft to the world, and we in America have a well-earned reputation as leaders in aviation in the world, and I want us to reach that shining example once again. Pilots know that tragedies don't occur in a vacuum. Catastrophic outcomes result in long succession of failures that often overwhelm the pilots at the control of the aircraft. We call it in aviation the accident chain. And there are many links in the accident chain that must happen that eventually overwhelms the pilots and you result in the crash. Many of these links in the accident chain happen with Boeing and your decisions in the development of the 737 MAX. So let me talk about what has happened here. You put a sensor on the outside of the aircraft, which is standard, but you allow that sensor to override the pilot's input in this system. So in every other 737 aircraft, there is the function of you can pull back the pilot, the cutout, and that will override that uncommanded nose down attitude. That is standard. That is the basic assumption. As you said, you use an industry standard on how a pilot would react to a malfunction like that. Uncommanded nose down, every pilot, including helicopter pilots, you pull back. But what you did was you put an MCAS system into an aircraft. You didn't tell the pilots that this MCAS system was in there, and you put in a function in order for MCAS to work the way you want it to work. After the pilot does the uncommanded reaction to the uncommanded nose down, in every other 737, cut out, that's the end of it. In the 737 MAX, after 5 seconds, the system resets and it pushes the nose right back down. The pilots had exactly 3 seconds to pull nose down, pull up. Now we got to do a new procedure that did not exist in previous 737 models, which is the electronic cutout switch, because you have now put into a system that overrides the pilot in command of that aircraft. So you've been telling this committee that, yes, you use basic pilot reactions. That is true, but you've not been telling this committee the whole truth. Time and again, this is my frustration. Boeing has not told the whole truth to this committee and to the families and to the people looking at this. Yes, the pilots did exactly what they were supposed to do, but 5 seconds later, especially if that sensor is still stuck, it overrides what the pilot does and it pushes the nose right back down again. 3 seconds, a pilot's best friend is time and altitude. And on takeoff, there is no altitude, and he's got no time. You set those pilots up for failure. And when I sent you a letter asking you to answer several questions, it took Boeing over 5 months to respond to my question. I only got the answers the day before you and I met. And one of the questions I asked was, what date did Boeing discover that a stock angle of attack vane would result in MCAS issuing persistent commands with unlimited authority to trim the airplane nose down? In layman's terms, if this vane is stuck, MCAS will continue to provide faulty directions and will keep pushing that nose down over and over and over again. No matter how many times an experienced 737 pilot pulls back on the yoke, 5 seconds later, reset, nose back down. You knew in 2016 that this was happening. And your team at Boeing decided we didn't need to fix that because of well-understood piloting techniques and procedures. But the problem is that well-understood piloting technique and procedures is to pull back, and that's it. But you added something else. You put in a system and you didn't tell pilots about, and then you put in an override by resetting the system 5 seconds later. Boeing is the company that built the Flying Fortress that saved Europe. I remember watching B-17s fly above the ground. It is a storied aircraft that has rescued the free world. And yet, you knew about these problems, and you continue to put them into the system into place. And when we asked you to answer these questions, you have told this committee and you've told me half-truths over and over again, including in that meeting. This is why I am so upset. You have not told us the whole truth, and these families are suffering because of it.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. Members of the committee, at this point, Senator Scott is deferring his time to the chairman of the subcommittee, Senator Cruz. You're recognized, sir, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Muilenburg, I have to say the testimony here today has been quite dismaying. I want to focus on the text exchange that has been referred to and has been publicly reported on. This was a text exchange between Mark Faulkner, who was then Boeing's technical pilot for the MAX, chief technical pilot for the MAX, and Mr. Gustafson, who in 2018 was promoted to being Boeing's 737 chief technical pilot. Is that right?
I believe that's the case, Senator. Yep.
So this exchange is stunning. Mr. Faulkner, oh, shocker alert. MCAS is now active down to M2. It's running rampant in the sim on me. At least that's what Vince thinks is happening. Gustafson's response, oh, great. That means we have to update the speed trim description in Volume 2. Mr. Faulkner, so basically I lied to the regulators unknowingly. Gustafson, it wasn't a lie. No one told us that was the case. Faulkner, I'm leveling off at like 4,000 feet, 230 knots, and the plane is trimming itself like crazy. I'm like, what? Gustafson, that's what I saw on Sim 1, but on approach, I think that's wrong. Faulkner, granted, I suck at flying, but even this was egregious. That exchange describes what happened in Lion Air and Ethiopian Air. The men and women who are gathered here with the photos of your loved ones, 346 people are dead because what these chief pilots described as egregious and crazy, that's their language. That's Boeing's internal language in this exchange. Now, what I find truly stunning, Boeing handed this exchange over to the Department of Justice in February. In March, I chaired a hearing of the Aviation Subcommittee on these two crashes. Boeing did not see fit to give this committee that exchange, nor did Boeing give it to the FAA or the Department of Transportation. But what I find most stunning is your testimony here today that you said you first learned of this exchange a couple of weeks ago. These are senior leaders at Boeing in an exchange saying, and I will quote again, so I basically lied to the regulators. Look, I've practiced law a lot of years. You had your lawyers look over this document, and they read a senior leader after these crashes has occurred saying they lied to the regulators. Mr. Muilenburg, how in the hell did nobody bring this to your attention in February when you produced this to the Department of Justice? How did you just read this a couple of weeks ago?
Senator, again, to clarify my earlier comments, I was made aware of the existence of this kind of document, this issue, as part of that discovery process in the investigation early in the year, as you pointed out. At that point, I counted on my counsel to handle that appropriately. And
did you read this exchange? Look, I was made aware documents were being produced, that is passive voice and disclaiming responsibility. You're the CEO. The buck stops with you. Did you read this document? And how did your team not put it in front of you, run in with their hair on fire, saying, we got a real problem here? How did that not happen, and what does that say about the culture at Boeing if they didn't give it to you and you didn't read it, and if you didn't say, I want to read and see what happened? Your testimony here earlier today is, well, we're not sure what they were talking about because he's not at Boeing anymore. How did you not in February set out a 9-alarm fire to say, we need to figure out exactly what happened, not after all the hearings, not after the pressure, but because 346 people have died and we don't want another person to die?
Senator, as you mentioned, I didn't see the details of this exchange until recently. And we're not quite sure what Mr. Faulkner meant by that exchange. His lawyer has suggested he was talking about a simulator that was in development in that time period. That's where he was working. That could be the case. We don't know. I fully support diving deep into this and understanding what he said and what he meant. But I can also tell you that in that same time frame where his original message was made.
Mr. Gustafson still works at Boeing.
Senator, yes, he does.
Have you had that conversation with him?
Senator, my team has talked with Patrick as well.
Have you had that conversation with him?
Senator, I have not.
Time has expired.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Senator Tester. Let's do this. The entire poster, Senator Cruz, if you can have that reduced in size, and we will enter it into the record without objection at this point. So ordered. Senator Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member for having this hearing. And I know for the two folks on the panel this morning, it is probably a painful morning for you. But the fact is, it's infinitely more painful for the folks that are sitting a couple rows behind you. You have said many times, Mr. Muilenburg, that mistakes were made, and obviously they were. Unfortunately, that admission was made after 346 people died. And there are a lot of reasons an airplane can go down, whether it's pilot error, weather, equipment malfunction, or birds. But safety should not be one of them. And in a previous question, you said you guys don't sell safety. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't listen to the whole thing, but you damn well better sell safety. I fly 4 legs a week, and there's a lot of, not for the grace of God, it could have been me on one of those airplanes. And we expect there to be safety. Obviously, something went wrong, and it's not the first time. There's the MCAS situation here that was pointed out, as several people on this committee have already pointed out to you, and nothing was done, or to your leadership team. There was a South Carolina whistleblower that talked about debris being left in the planes. Those technicians were removed. There's a KC-46 finding wrench bolts and trash inside the new airplanes. That was in June of this year. There was a cargo 777. You get the deal. It goes on. And so the question is the one that Senator Udall brought up that you didn't answer, and I think other people on this committee also brought it up, and that is, what do we do? What do you do? So I'll be a little more specific. I do believe there's a cozy relationship, and I don't believe that, quite frankly, time and money are no object, because there's also plenty of examples. For example, in 2014, FAA made regulatory changes to safety standards that would have required changes to the MAX to add new crew alerts. Boeing appealed it to the FAA to seek an exemption, arguing that it would cost too much money, $10 billion, which is a lot of money. But the truth is that it wouldn't have happened if FAA would have been doing their job, and it also wouldn't have happened if you would have known what the hell was going on. So my question is that, and I know there was a push a number of decades ago about privatization of federal government, and I think that's how we got here, is privatization of government. But why don't we just turn over the certification back to the FAA and let them do it, and then they would be the ones sitting at this desk today and not you? Why not do that?
Well, Senator, we share your focus on safety, and I can confidently say that is our #1 priority.
Okay, cool, but we failed in this case, and there's a whole bunch of people back there that are going through incredible anguish because we failed.
Senator, I agree, and we feel terrible about that.
Let's get to the question, and look, I can pivot with the best of them. I know how to pivot. I know when people are pivoting. You're pivoting. Tell me if you would support having the FAA do the certification.
Senator, we believe the delegated authority process that we have today has contributed to improved safety over the last 2 decades.
Okay.
As I mentioned earlier, we are open to improving it, but the idea that we can tap the deep technical expertise of our companies across the aerospace industry is a valuable part of the certification process, but the FAA is the certification authority and should be and should continue to be.
Well, but they really aren't. The truth is you can say that they have the ultimate responsibility, but the truth is, if the issues aren't flagged by the ODA, by your people, by your people doing the certification. The FAA never does it because, quite frankly, it would cost some more money to have the FAA do the certification. And by the way, it's cost you money, so we could charge you for that certification to help pay for it, so it would have no reflection on the taxpayers. So the question becomes, I'm going to tell you what, when the FAA says you didn't need to do this, and you come in and say, no, you don't need to do this, it's fine if nothing happens, but when 350 people die, we got a problem. And you bring up the point that Senator Cruz brought up, that there was plenty of information out there on this, and nothing was done. And so the whole thing about it, you know, when it comes to safety, time and money are no object, is not, the record certainly doesn't show that.
Senator, I understand your points and criticism, and I think it's true that we operate in a very competitive world. You know, we are the only large airplane, commercial airplane maker left in the United States. We do have competitive pressures around the world, but I can also tell you that never takes precedence over safety.
But it did
Our
in this,
business model
look,
is safe airplanes.
I think it absolutely could be argued that it did in this case, and I heard Senator Duckworth's questions, and Boeing has had an incredibly valuable name. But I've got to tell you, and I think I told you guys this in office some time ago, I would walk before I was to get on a 737 MAX. I would walk. There's no way. And the question becomes, when issues like this happen, it costs your company huge. And so you shouldn't be cutting corners, and I see corners being cut, and this committee is going to have to do something to stop that from happening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Tester. I'm going to ask that Mr. Muilenburg answer on the record his opinion of the current ODA system, whether it should be modified, and answer to Senator Tester's question. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me add my condolences to the surviving family, members, and friends of the victims of these tragedies. Mr. Muilenburg, among many failures, it strikes me there are two primary failures. First and foremost, in the original design and certification process, and then secondly, in the reaction after the first crash. So let's concentrate on those two things. Tell me if I'm getting this right. The 737, very successful airframe, new, more fuel-efficient engines were available, and so you wanted to include that in an upgrade of that airframe, correct?
New fuel-efficient engines and some other enhancements.
And those fuel-efficient engines create a different aerodynamic for that aircraft, correct?
That's correct.
Is the MCAS system, is that a standard type of automatic pilot type of software system on planes? Is that pretty standard to have something like that?
Senator, the MCAS system that we have on the MAX is unique to that airplane.
So it was put in there specifically because you added a different type of engine to a known successful airframe, which made that less stable and required some kind of, as you called it, a runaway stabilizing system.
Senator, if I can clarify that, the 737 family has a system called the Speed Trim System, and the MCAS is an extension of that system that's unique for the MAX. But
again, unique because of that added engine design.
We tailor the software of each one of our airplanes so that they optimize the handling qualities for the unique airplane configuration.
But again, going into the introduction of this 737 MAX, you realize that that airframe was changed because of those engines and required this MCAS system for stabilization.
Yep, that was one of the additions we made to create the handling qualities we wanted for the pilots. We also made some changes to things like the vortex generators on the wing. So it's an integrated solution to create.
But again, you were well aware that this design change created something that required an MCAS system. So now fast forward, you have the Lion Air tragedy. According to Senator Cruz, the email that he sent up there, which I believe was written on November 15, 2016, just a couple weeks after that Lion Air crash, there are people, it sure appears in Boeing, that knew exactly or certainly suspected what went wrong because they integrated in the design. You had an MCAS system to take care of this eventuality in the flight characteristic, correct?
Senator, again, I'm not exactly sure what was meant by that email traffic, but I can tell you in that time frame.
It seems pretty obvious, doesn't it? I mean, doesn't it seem pretty obvious? I mean, again,
you are you are engineers. You understand how this was designed. You understood you need an MCAS system to make up for that instability, and then something happened. Pretty well, I would think, diagnosed pretty fast. I mean, again, I'm reading these things. I'm not a pilot. I'm not an aerospace engineer. And yet I'm scratching my head going, whoa, something really wrong happened. You know a whole lot. Why didn't you react faster?
Well, Senator, completely separate from that email traffic and what it might mean, our team very quickly after the Lion Air accident assembled with the regulators. We evaluated the data from the accident. We saw that MCAS was involved. And so we began to take quick action immediately. It doesn't have to do with that email. That's not relevant to that discussion. Our team was immediately identifying that.
Which is exactly
began
my
work.
point. The fact that it took another tragedy to actually ground the airplane so you could actually have a true, a fix that worked is, I think, really what's on the table here. And the diagnosis is why didn't we react? Why didn't we ground that aircraft a lot sooner so that another tragedy wouldn't happen?
Senator, we have asked that question over and over. And you know, if we knew everything back then that we know now, we would have made a different decision. The decision that was made on that, at that point with the data we had, we quickly convened a safety review board. The FAA, coming out of that, confirmed the continuing airworthiness of the airplane and issued that officially. That was the safety case that was built. But Senator, as you point out, we've learned from the second accident, and if we could go back, we would have made a different decision. And we have learned. We are making those improvements to MCAS, and that's where our focus is going forward.
Well, Boeing is an important company. It's important for our economy. I want to see you get this right, but you have to properly diagnose this. You have to accept responsibility for what happened, so we actually can make those changes, both within Boeing, also within the FAA. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Rosen.
Thank you. And I want to thank all the families that are here today who have lost their most precious loved ones. Their deaths should not be in vain. And we all have to do every bit of our part together to make sure that we prevent future tragedies from happening, and in order to honor the memories of these 346 souls and the empty chairs that they will leave behind this Thanksgiving and Christmas and on and on and on. And so you said additional information wasn't available. I want to touch a little bit on MCAS and Brazil. According to news reports, when the Brazilian National Civil Aviation Agency came to the U.S. in 2017 to test out the MAX 8, they determined that changes made to the old 737 were significant enough that they needed much more information from Boeing and were going to provide it for their pilots. When they eventually published their pilot training requirements, they were therefore able to flag the MCAS as one of the changes the pilots needed to take into consideration when flying the MAX 8. And yet, for United States pilots, MCAS wasn't mentioned in their manual. So, Mr. Muilenburg, why was this information not flagged for your other customers who had 737 MAXs in their fleet? Did you prevent your company from sharing these differences to other regulatory bodies or operators? I have here the Brazilian manual. They decided their pilots should learn this, and why wouldn't you provide it to the United States pilots?
Senator, I can't comment on the details of the Brazilian document. John may be able to, but let me more broadly make the point that that's exactly how the process is supposed to work. We provide information. We evaluate with the regulators in the various jurisdictions what should be included in the training. We have no desire to hide features of the airplane that pilots need to know
They reported
about.
back to you, and it was significant enough for them to put this in their manual. Then why wouldn't you consider that it was a significant change?
Yeah, and Senator, I understand your point, and that was a decision that was made in Brazil. Again, I'm not familiar with the details of that one, but the discussion.
Let me just ask you this question then. Moving forward, will you commit to making it a practice when other countries are clearly paying attention enough to make significant changes to their pilot manuals based on major operational changes, that Boeing will send these notifications of changes to the other users of these aircraft, so at least they have the opportunity to train their pilots? You denied them the opportunity, sir.
Senator, we are committed to sharing that information, and that's part of our international collaboration. But I also want to note again that the discussion around MCAS training and whether it would be included in the training manuals, that was an active, iterative discussion with the FAA, and it was a decision made based on safety. Again, we try to put information in the training manuals that focuses on the effects of failures and things that will be valuable to the pilots. And it's not always the case that more information adds to safety, although in this case, we understand this, and this is one of the additions going forward.
Brazil thought it added to their safety. But I want to touch a little bit on Senator Fisher, the question that she raised earlier. All these changes have taken place, of course, over the years, and this plane is still working off its original certification from 1967. This is despite the fact that pilots have told me that the MAX 8 is in no way functionally similar to the original 737s that took to the skies 52 years ago. Like I said in the last hearing that we had, it seems to me like there have been so many significant modifications, it's almost as if you took a canoe and turned it into a cruise ship. So, Mr. Hamilton, can you tell us how many derivative certificates Boeing has received for the 737 since initially being certified over 50 years ago?
Senator, I don't have the exact number in my head. It's approximately, I think, 14. But
14 or 814? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
14 derivatives.
14 derivatives.
Yeah, but let me take the action to follow up with you on that and get you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And the last thing I'm going to ask, do you believe that the 737 MAX is functionally the same plane that was certified in 1967?
Senator, as I mentioned to the earlier senator, the safety standards have evolved as the airplane has evolved. And one of the important things I think to understand is what's really important also is for the pilots as they transition from an earlier version of the 737 to the newer version, that the airplane behaves and handles in the same way. That was important from a handling characteristic standpoint. And
important enough for Brazil to mention, but not for us.
With respect to that, Senator, so there is a joint operation evaluation board that determines the training, but other regulators can determine what training they want to do above and beyond based on their information. I don't know the specifics of the Brazilian document that you're referencing. We can follow up on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairman. So, Mr. Muilenburg, I don't want to absolve you from both the opportunity and the responsibility to go back and look at that long question from Senator Tester and answer it for the record. But for now, one of the central thoughts in that question was, why shouldn't we change this process and go back to where it's no longer cooperative, where the FAA takes full responsibility? Give me the answer to that. Should this process be changed where the federal government is fully responsible with employees only hired by the federal government? What impact would that have on safety, do you think?
Senator, I believe the data clearly shows that creation of the delegated authority process and its implementation has enhanced safety over the last couple of decades. I mentioned earlier about a 95% improvement in aviation safety over the last couple of decades. I think a portion of that at least can be attributed to the delegated authority process. That doesn't mean we shouldn't refine it, reform it over time, but the fundamental process of strong government oversight combined with deep industry technical knowledge in the right balance is a strong safety process. And I firmly believe that's one of the things that's contributed to aviation safety. And that process demands oversight, and we are fully supportive of strong oversight, but we also fully support the idea of tapping deep industry technical expertise, and that combination is the safest combination.
And what do you think the view of the industry technicians is of their responsibility there? Do you think they feel the right level of both responsibility and liability of providing the information that they need to provide?
Senator, they do. And I can tell you that's the culture of our company. And I respect the comments that were made today and the questions that have been raised about our culture. We deserve the scrutiny. But I've been at this company for 34 years. I know the people of Boeing. You all know the people of Boeing. These are 150,000 people that every day come to work because they have an important mission. They are honest. They are resolute in their efforts. They are committed to safety. That's our culture. And every employee at Boeing, that's just how we think about the work we do. And we're going to continue to improve as a company. I'm not saying we've done everything right. As I've noted today, we've gotten some things wrong. But this is a great company with a great legacy that's committed to excellence. And where we can improve, we will. Where we can learn, we will. But our culture is about safety. That is at the very core of Boeing. It's been that way for 103 years.
All right, Mr. Hamilton, on the, I had 2 or 3 questions that actually Senator Rosen just asked, pursuing that further. But on, you've got a 1967 certification that's had 14 variants since 1967. You have a significantly different plane just based on the 14th variant of the original plane. What difference do you think it would have made if the certification process would have gone back to we're certifying a new plane? Would that have made a difference in the MCAS system, or you've been doing this a long time? What difference would it have made if we hadn't built on the previous half century of this plane's history and just had started with a new plane? Would that have been better or worse?
In Part 21 of the federal regulations, it spells out the changed product rule, which is how you assess for a derivative type certification. And it's a process it's in the USFA's regulations. It's also in European and other countries' regulations. And it requires you to look at all significant changes and step up. I think there's an assumption here that a derivative type cert is less robust than a new type cert. I think when you look at a new type cert, you oftentimes have some exceptions or equivalent levels of safety very similar to what you see on a derivative. So I'm not sure it would have necessarily resulted in a safer airplane. It might have driven some different design decisions, though. But fundamentally, one of the things that happened in these 2 accidents was this assumption around how we expected crews to respond under certain situations, which proved to be it did not happen. And I think that's a fundamental issue that we have to address as an industry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blunt. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today and for taking our questions. I will tell you this, as you've responded, you've addressed senator, senator, senator. I think you should be addressing victims because they're the ones we're asking questions on behalf of. Yep. And they're the ones who have come today on behalf of their family members. Another thing I want to ask you, you've mentioned a couple of times a lack of awareness of emails or documents or communications. And, Mr. Muilenburg, we have something around here before we vote. We say we read the bill so that we know what's in it. And if we need to ask questions, we ask questions. And we develop that awareness that is so necessary to make good decisions and to have a full view of the situation that is in front of us. And it is disconcerting to hear someone who's to be the leader of a company to say, I wasn't aware, or I didn't know, or hadn't read that. Nobody made me aware of that. I depended on that. We call that passing the buck. And it is your responsibility, if you're going to lead the company, to have that awareness. So have you, at this point, read each and every page of every document that is relative to this situation in this case?
Senator, I can't say I've read every document, every page. I know we've provided more than 500,000 pages of documents as part of the production process over the last year. I accept your input and your criticism. I am accountable, our company's accountable. Accountability starts
I
with me.
appreciate that, but I think that it is unsettling to hear you say, I haven't read that. Let me move on. I do believe you're in the business of safety as a priority. And even though you say you don't sell safety, let's talk a little bit about the simulators, because you had pilots that were training in the simulators as well as training in flight, correct?
You're referring during the MAX development?
Yes.
Senator? Yes.
Yes. Okay, so the simulators that were being used for training, were they built by the same engineers with the same components, the same sensors, the same systems as the MAX system?
Senator, we have a wide variety of simulators, some of which are what we call conformed simulators, which represent the actual hardware and software of the airplane. We have others that are engineering
So it is conceivable
simulators.
that some of the pilots were not training on this specific simulator. And then you also, you know, Mr. Peters had started down a line of questioning with you about the pilots and the pilots that were trained, and you only had highly experienced pilots in simulators before flying the new MAX system, correct?
Senator, I was referring to our Boeing test pilots. We also have pilots from a number of other organizations, regulators, and airlines
Why would
that
you not
participate.
choose pilots with a variety of experience, a wide range of experience? Because there are pilots with a wide range of experience that are going to be in that cockpit, flying that plane in real time.
Senator, I agree with your view on the necessity of having a variety of pilot experiences involved in the testing process. But again, our Boeing pilots are not the only testers in the process.
Okay, well then let's take it this way. What changes are you going to make in the simulators and in the training that is going to bring to account for human factor?
Yeah, Senator, we've made several changes and have more to come. But to start, the baseline training program for the MAX is roughly a 24-day training program, which includes heavy use of simulators, advanced simulators. We've also modified the computer-based training for the incremental training between the NG and the MAX. We've added visibility to the training materials for the MCAS system that we've talked about. That new training is all currently being evaluated and will be ultimately certified by the regulators to make it a baseline in the program. We're also investing R&D significantly in advanced simulation.
Let me ask you this. I appreciate all of that and appreciate your answer. Prior to these occurrences, did you feel that your training was not sufficient?
Senator, no, we implemented the training that was planned and certified for the airplane.
Okay. Yield back.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, my heart goes out to all the families. I mean, I just can't imagine, you know, the impact on these families after these tragic accidents. Florida, I come from Florida, so air travel is pretty big deal for us. 126 million people traveled to Florida's tourists last year, and a lion's share of them came by aircraft. So the safety of everybody is really important. Mr. Muilenburg, the president and CEO of your commercial airlines was let go after this. What's your process to hold people accountable to make sure, you know, this doesn't happen again?
Yeah. Senator, first of all, my company and I are accountable. I believe that accountability starts with me. My board took some recent actions regarding my position, which I fully support, and will allow me to focus even more on safety. So every action we take is try to focus on safety. I have also taken some management actions. Again, those are focused on operational excellence and safety going forward. As other reviews are completed, if we see additional actions that need to be taken, we won't hesitate. But in some cases, accountability also includes improvements to our processes and our organization structure. And that gets to some of the changes we announced on our safety review boards, our new safety organization, our new board safety committee, and the realignment of all 50,000 of our engineers to our chief engineer in terms of reporting structure. All of those accountability actions are important, and all of them are focused on safety.
So if any of your, whether it's engineers or non-engineers, if somebody has a concern in the future about safety, what's the process you've created to make sure that it gets to you and you can react to it? Because ultimately, as a CEO, the buck stops with you.
Yeah. Senator, that's been one of the key learnings from this whole process is we need to elevate the visibility on safety issues that might come up at the ground floor level, make sure they get the right visibility and action. So a couple of things we've done there. One is, again, restructuring our safety review boards. So I now get a weekly update on safety review boards from across the Boeing enterprise at a detailed level, which I've found to be very helpful. We've also, with the stand-up of our new safety organization under Beth Pastor, instead of having those safety teams underneath our businesses, they're now separated and report up through our chief engineer. Any safety concerns that employees have will come through that organization. We've set up a new anonymous reporting system for those employees that might want to make anonymous reports to facilitate that. And we continue to have a full range of ethics hotlines across our enterprise that encourage employees to make their inputs. And we have a culture of asking our employees to speak up. We want them to speak up. We want to make sure they're heard and that we take action.
Have you made any changes at the board level that to increase the accountability for all employees?
Yeah. Well, Senator, our board has been very engaged in this entire process. One of the things we did is now about 6 months ago, I asked our board to set up a independent review led by Admiral Giambastiani. He has tremendous safety background. That committee came forward with a number of recommendations, some of which I mentioned in things that we've implemented. Our board will continue to be engaged in that process. And this new safety organization that I talked about, in addition to reporting to the chief engineer and to me, it also provides independent audit, if you will, back into our board. And our board has set up a new aerospace safety committee that's now permanent, headed up by Admiral Giambastiani. As you might have seen on Friday, we added another board member, Admiral Richardson, who also has deep experience in safety. He will also be a member of that committee. And so our safety organization will have an independent reporting line to them as well, which I think is a good disciplined process.
I had to go preside, so I didn't get to hear all the testimony, but have you made any recommendations to this committee on things that at the federal level we ought to be doing differently to make sure whether it's Boeing or Airbus or anybody else, this doesn't happen again?
Senator, we've discussed a number of options there. Again, we have learned, and there are some things that we need to fix that are related to the airplane design and training and communications. We also think there are some opportunities to reform our processes and how we work together as a government and industry. And we're very supportive of any actions there that would enhance safety.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to express my sympathies and condolences to the family members here. We have a safe commercial aviation industry in America, but I think we always have to look at ways to improve it. Industry, the airlines, FAA, Congress. So I'm sure it's difficult for the family members to be here, but it's important that you're here, so I want to thank you for that. I'm going to start with just a bit of a kind of a parochial question. Mr. Muilenburg, Mr. Hamilton, Alaska Airlines is my state's airline. It's a very good airline. It's certainly critically important to my state. I know it is to the ranking member's state as well. They fly almost all 737 Boeings. We Alaskans travel a lot. I've had many constituents in the aftermath of these MAX crashes that have asked me, are the 737s that we are flying on all the time in Alaska to and from Seattle and other places safe? So can both of you assure my constituents that these 737s are safe, that are such an important component of the Alaska air travel?
Yes, Senator, the 737 NG fleet that Alaska operates is a safe fleet. It's a safe airplane. And it's got about 200 million hours of air safety track record behind it.
Mr. Hamilton?
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Muilenburg's comments. I agree with Mr. Muilenburg's comments. I also just want to state that we have a weekly meeting that we review all the reports that are coming in from the fleet on whether or not they are a potential safety issue or not.
So the MAX issues that we're focused on here with regard to 737s are not issues that exist with your other line of 737s, 800s, 900s?
No.
That's correct.
Let me ask, and I know the House side was looking at this issue as we focus, as this committee is, on the tragic lessons learned from the MAX 737 accidents. Should we also take the time to ensure that the other 737 models that are receiving less attention now are nevertheless continue to be safe, and to take the opportunity to look at the FAA certification process on those to make sure that that is not bedeviled with some of the challenges that we are discussing here with regard to the MAX? Would you agree that that's an opportunity to not just focus on the MAX, but the overall process to reboot the focus, both at your company but also in the FAA, on safety?
Senator, I believe there are a number of independent reviews underway right now looking at that broader certification process, some of which have begun to report out. We support that broader look.
So models that aren't just the MAX?
All models. So we are taking an end-to-end comprehensive look at the certification process, and I believe there are a number of government independent reviews that are focused on that.
Let me ask for both of you, I keep hearing from safety experts about the importance of what they refer to as functional safety, and that is the way the different systems work together with the operator, as opposed to looking at each system as it's added to a new model in a vacuum. And it seems to me that this issue of functional safety is a core issue as it relates to the MAX, given what has happened. Can you tell the committee about what your company's approach to this issue of functional safety is when adding new systems to an existing aircraft like the 737? Obviously, there was a failure here on that issue. How are you working to improve that? And does the FAA do enough to focus on this idea of functional safety, not just the individual additions to existing and older models?
I'll ask John to take that question.
Yeah, so Senator, I think it starts with our requirements breakdown of what's our airplane level requirements, system level requirements, component level requirements, and then validating at the component level, the system level, and at the airplane level how any change met the requirements and interacted across at the system or airplane level. You also talked about regulatory requirements.
Yes.
There's something called...
Does the FAA focus enough, you think, on functional safety?
So there's been some rather recent changes in what we call development assurance that I think is continuing to mature. And again, this looks at the functional safety, and some of the things that you're really focused at is the breakdown of requirements and how different systems interact with that. So I think we, as Mr. Muilenburg pointed out, some of the recent industry committee reports have discussed this, and I think we'll support those recommendations and the FAA's actions going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan, and thank you to the panel. We appreciate you being with us, and I'm sure we'll be questioning you further as we continue to get more reports. Our second panel of witnesses will be escorted in now. We thank you two gentlemen for being with us.